Okay, picking back up with question number 9. Why did the Supreme Court uphold the constitutionality of Japanese internment in the court case Korematsu v. United States? So again, in this case, the Supreme Court said Japanese internment during World War II was constitutional. It was okay. The reasoning was during wartime, emergency measures can be taken. We see this over and over again in U.S. history that civil rights and civil liberties are limited during wartime. And the Supreme Court said that was okay for these Japanese Americans to be interned, again, because it was a wartime measure. Number 10, what was the significance of the Yalta Conference in 1945? So this was a meeting between Roosevelt from the United States, Churchill from Great Britain, and Stalin from the Soviet Union. At this conference, they discussed most significantly the post-war division of Europe. What would happen to some of these countries that were liberated from the Nazis, who would have influence in certain parts of Europe. They also discussed the formation of the United Nations and also the Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Number 11, list some arguments for both sides of the debate over the use of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So some of the arguments in favor of using the bombs was that dropping the bomb would end the war quickly. It would actually save lives because it would prevent the eventual invasion of Japan from happening. There was the argument that we had spent a lot of time and money to develop the bomb. We had it, so we should use it. And finally, that using the bomb would intimidate the Soviets. As far as being against the dropping of the bomb, there was the argument that hundreds of thousands of people would die, most of them civilians. Using the bomb was unnecessary to end the war. There were other ways to bring the war to a conclusion. And again, it caused too much destruction against civilian targets and wasn't targeting military installations. Finally, number 12, what were the Nuremberg trials? So these were trials of some of the leading Nazi war criminals, some of the lead SS officers, people who were responsible for the Holocaust, for the concentration camps, some of Hitler's top circle. And again, it was because they had committed crimes against humanity. These trials sent a message that even during wartime, you can't do things like mass executing civilians. Number 13, how were soldiers assisted by the GI Bill after World War II? So the GI Bill did several things, most notably provided money for college and gave scholarships to those returning soldiers who wanted to go to college or trade school. It also gave them loans to buy houses and also loans to start businesses. 14, what were some of the effects of the baby boom? So the baby boom was this huge population growth that occurred as soldiers came home after the war and wanted to have new babies and start families. So from about 1945 till about 1964, there was a big growth in population. This led to increased demand for things like housing and schools, a lot of spending by consumers, and expanded middle class. Long-term, the effects of the baby boom, now that some of these babies that were born back then are getting older, is a strain on certain public health systems like Medicare, a strain on the Social Security system, and then also increased demand for housing and for services for senior citizens. Number 16, what impact did the Soviet launch of Sputnik have on American society? So remember, Sputnik was a Soviet satellite that was launched in the 1950s. This ends up really kind of scaring the Americans that the Soviets were getting ahead of us as far as the space race. So it leads to an increased spending on science and technology, education in those fields, more scientific research, and this includes the creation of NASA. Number 17, describe what happened to the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union immediately after World War II. So as soon as the war ended, we were not allies with the Soviets anymore, and the Soviets and communist expansion overall was viewed as a threat to the United States. And what is meant by that term, Cold War? This refers to the intense kind of rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviets over competing control over certain parts of the world, over competing social systems and economic systems. So the U.S. and the Soviets never fight directly. What we do see, though, are what we call proxy wars, where the U.S. maybe is fighting against someone like the North Koreans who are backed by the Soviets, or there are two sides fighting in a civil war, one side backed by the U.S., one side backed by the Soviets. But it's that huge rivalry and support for different sides in wars that takes place most of over the latter half of the 20th century. Finally, 19. What did British leader Winston Churchill mean when he said that an iron curtain had fallen over Europe? So this iron curtain phrase came from a speech that Churchill had given, and basically that refers to the Soviet domination over many countries in Eastern Europe and the Soviets imposing the communist system over a lot of the territory in Eastern Europe that they had liberated from the Nazis. We'll put back up with 20 in our next video.